Some musicians just have a freakish amount of talent. Most of us learn at a young age that we are not those people. For those who do have that talent to go on to be the singer-songwriters, there's something almost magical about listening to them perform. But it's easy to forget that behind all of the music is a very ordinary person, and sometimes that ordinary person is a terrible human being. Johnny Cash's women troubles. There's a lot of dark stuff in Johnny Cash's life, but let's talk about just how horrible he was to women. Vivian Cash's book, I Walked the Line, My Life with Johnny, was a heartbreaking tell-all, detailing how she continued loving her husband, even through the drugs and the affair with his more famous second partner, June Carter Cash. It was Vivian who gave him 4 daughters, raised them, and who stuck with him through the worst, but June gets all the credit. Behind closed doors, June Carter didn't actually have it any easier, in spite of the storybook romance performed for the public eye. According to biographer Robert Hilburn, Cash had cheated on her when she was pregnant with her son John Carter. There were more than a few women, but the one that had to hurt the most was June's own sister, Anita. John Carter has also gone on record talking about his parents' less-than-perfect marriage, and has said his mother's drug addictions and descent into paranoia came from a near-constant fear he was cheating yet again. That fear spread to their son, who grew up well aware his family could fall apart at any time because his father couldn't stay faithful. Elvis's underage flings. Elvis was only 21 when he became ridiculously famous with the success of Heartbreak Hotel, and after that, all bets were off when it came to how far he would go. Along with the fame and fortune came the admiration of countless women, but according to biographer Joel Williamson, there was a particular type of woman Elvis liked: the really, really young ones. When the newly made megastar went on those early tours, he took along a group of 14-year-old girls, and Williamson says he was a huge fan of tickling and pillow fights. Future wife Priscilla was 14 when they met, and just what went on behind closed doors is debated. What's not debated is that he lost interest in her after Lisa Marie was born and went on to court another 14-year-old. There was the potential for violence in Elvis, too. Years later, he was engaged to 21-year-old Ginger Alden, who claimed he once pulled out a gun and put a bullet in the headboard of the bed she was sleeping in. He called it an attention getter. Johnny Paycheck's attempted murder. Johnny Paycheck was one of the Grand Ole Opry's most respected members, and was known as something of a country music outlaw too, as his entire career was colored by drug and alcohol use. His difficulty staying out of trouble started way before he was a star though, and when he was still a teenager he enlisted in the US Navy, punched a superior officer, and spent a few years in prison. The record deal came after that, and so did the check forgery and the attempted murder.
Johnny Paycheck, one of the outlaws of country music, is now singing the blues behind bars.
Paycheck was on his way home for the holidays in December 1985 when he stopped off at a Hillsboro, Ohio bar for a drink. He was recognized by a local named Larry Wise. They got to chatting, and no one's entirely sure what happened next. Whatever offenses were caused, it ended with Paycheck grazing Wise's head with a bullet, and he'd later testify the music legend had, quote, blowed my hat off. The case dragged on, and Paycheck was sentenced again. Chuck Berry's icky past. Chuck Berry was a legend who helped shape rock and roll. He also once punched Keith Richards in the mouth, and what could Richards have done to deserve that?
His guitar was laid out in his case, and I thought, oh, come on, Keith, just a touch.
Berry's attitude got him into all kinds of trouble, and he even had a name for those incidents, his naughties. It started when, as a teenager, he did 3 years in a reform school for stealing cars and a bit of armed robbery. Fast forward to 1962, when Berry was 36 years old. He was tossed in the clink for violating the Mann Act, a law that prohibits taking a woman across state lines with immoral intentions. Oh, and she was 14.
Berry, you are under arrest for transporting a minor across state lines for the purpose of prostitution.
I did not touch. First of all, I didn't transport anyone anyway. I didn't solicit anything.
That's not all. In December 1989, Berry was accused of videotaping women in the not-so-private privacy of the bathroom of one of Berry's restaurants. The following June, his property was raided, with law enforcement finding weapons, pot, and the videotapes in question, placing him at the center of a class-action lawsuit. Berry's camp eventually settled, but that seriously tarnished his legacy. Brian Jones, anti-establishment and abusive. Brian Jones passed away when he was 27, not long after the Rolling Stones had made the decision to move on without him. It wasn't a surprising choice. Jones made Keith Richards look like the one you'd choose to bring home to meet your parents. There were, of course, the drugs and the pills, but his troubles started long before that. How long? He was kicked out of his grammar school for inciting rebellion, and it sort of spiraled from there. In public, he got in the face of anyone who didn't understand their music, and behind closed doors he had a violent streak a mile wide. Anita Pallenberg was one of the original muses for the Stones, and she'd eventually go on to have a long-term relationship with Richards. But she started out with Jones, and Rolling Stone magazine says it was an abusive relationship that ended when he hit her so hard he broke his hand on her face.
It ended up very badly, because by then Brian had become very abusive and very kind of envious, and Keith couldn't bear the way Brian treated me.
Sympathy for the devil indeed. Steven Tyler's child girlfriend. There are two sides to every story, and really, both sides to this one are uncomfortable. When Aerosmith frontman Steven Tyler wrote his 2011 memoir, Does the Noise in My Head Bother You?, he talked a bit about early girlfriend Julia Holcomb. Tyler wrote he had nicknamed her Little Bo Peep, said they liked to get it on in public, and left out a lot of other details. Holcomb wanted to clear the air about what she says really happened, so she took to LifeSite to tell her side of the story. According to her, she was a 16-year-old from a broken family when she met Tyler and kicked off a relationship with him that really started when her troubled mother signed documents making Tyler her legal guardian. Holcomb says she was already pregnant by the time he asked her to marry him, and plans for a family started to fall apart when his grandmother refused to pass on her ring. 5 months into the pregnancy, Holcomb was trapped in a house fire and sent to the hospital, where she says Tyler convinced her to have an abortion. Holcomb left him and returned to her parents. Tyler returned to the rock star life, but has since spoken openly about regretting the decisions he's made in the past. Richard Wagner's anti-Semitism. Even people completely unfamiliar with classical music know the work of Wagner. Wagner died in 1883, decades before the rise of Hitler and his Nazis. That means he wasn't around to see his music heralded as the soundtrack of the rise of anti-Semitism, but he probably wouldn't have hated the association. Wagner wrote a ton of jaw-dropping hate, including the idea Jews could only mimic art they'd seen and heard. When he struggled as an up-and-coming composer, he even blamed Jewish critics for keeping him from success. Frank Sinatra's destructive temper. Frank Sinatra was iconic on stage, but there was a lot of shady stuff that happened offstage. According to The Telegraph, his temper was so bad that one of his wives once described him as a sort of Jekyll and Hyde character, and there's a whole list of physical altercations he was involved in. First, the ones where someone got seriously hurt. According to legends about the man who did things his way, he punched a reporter in 1948, but eventually settled the assault and battery charges filed against him. In an unrelated incident, he threw a phone at a random businessman who was staying at the Beverly Hills Hotel and cracked the man's skull. Keeping with the theme of throwing things, he nearly killed then-wife Ava Gardner by throwing a champagne bottle at her so hard it cracked the bathroom sink. Sinatra destroyed an insane amount of stuff too, usually in fits of rage. Further legends say that he took a knife to a friend's Norman Rockwell painting, threw a malfunctioning TV out of a window at the Sands Hotel, and smashed a car radio when the Doors' Light My Fire came on. So he must have really loved it when his daughter Nancy covered the song on her 1969 album. Not a gentleman, to say the least.
Nobody's perfect, but some people aren't even close. This includes some of the most beloved figures in all of history. They look great at first glance, but a closer look reveals the deeply flawed, kinda terrible people they really were. Gandhi. Mahatma Gandhi, probably one of the 10 most peaceful men of all time, had a much bigger problem than the British ruling India. According to Gandhi biographer Jad Adams, Gandhi was actually a sex addict. He even left his dying father's side just to have sex with his wife. He was 15 at the time, she was 16, and the grief of abandoning his father caused him to abandon lustful love forever, kind of.
It is time you left.
At age 38, he took an official vow of chastity, but regularly tested it in unusual, creeptastic ways. His preferred method was to sleep alongside women while naked. That might sound to you very unchaste, and you'd be right. He was a middle-aged man sleeping in the buff with girls half his age. Sometimes more than one girl at a time even.
You dog!
Of course, this behavior wasn't acceptable for anyone else. In his mind, every Indian should practice strict chastity, to the point of never marrying. If they must marry, they should never have sex with their spouses. His married followers, meanwhile, were segregated on his compounds, told to never have sex and should take cold baths if they ever feel their mojo rising. That's the real Gandhi. Great for Indian independence, bad for keeping the young women in your life company. Mother Teresa. It's borderline blasphemous to criticize Mother Teresa, who became Saint Teresa in 2016. No one did more to help the poor and the sick, right? Well, not quite. According to reports, Mother Teresa's true motives were actually kind of selfish, with less focus on helping people and more on boosting the numbers of her own religion.
Right from the very beginning, I wanted to serve the poor purely for the love of God.
Mother Teresa's missions rarely actually helped poor, sick people become healthy. In fact, most of these places were dirty, short on doctors, low on food, and largely bereft of painkillers. Nevertheless, Teresa found the suffering beautiful, like it was making the world a better, holier place. We know this because she said it herself. There is something beautiful in seeing the poor accept their lot. To suffer it like Christ's passion, the world gains much from their suffering. Naturally, this didn't apply to Teresa herself, who received ample medical treatment when she needed it.
Nothing further, Your Honor.
Winston Churchill. We all know Winston Churchill for his efforts in fighting the Nazis during World War II. But as it turns out, he was a white supremacist who had way more in common with his enemies than history wants to let on.
We are the chosen few.
According to Richard Toye's book, Churchill's Empire, young Churchill took part in what he called a lot of jolly little wars against barbarous peoples in Africa. He believed Africans were violent against the British not because the Brits were invading their land, but because they had a, quote, strong aboriginal propensity to kill. Later, when he joined Parliament, Churchill advocated more war against minorities, claiming that the Aryan stock is bound to triumph. Of the Kurds who tried to gain independence from Britain, he said, "I am strongly in favor of using poisoned gas against uncivilized tribes. It would spread a lively terror." Jolly little wars, a lively terror? Who knew Churchill spoke exactly like a 1980s cartoon villain?
Oh no, Thundercat! I am not so easily disposed of!
Churchill also wasn't a fan of Gandhi's effort to rid India of British rule, admitting, "I hate Indians. They are a beastly people with a beastly religion." He didn't mellow out as he got older either. In 1943, in between rousing speeches about never surrendering, he refused to help India survive a severe famine that ultimately killed around 3 million people. Churchill blamed the Indians, saying it was all their fault for breeding like rabbits. No wonder President Obama didn't want that man's bust in the White House.
All of you will be damned. There is no place in heaven for you.
Steve Jobs. If you own anything Apple aside from an actual apple, you owe a debt of gratitude to Steve Jobs. That said, he probably shouldn't be put on the lofty pedestal he so often is. He was ruthless. According to the documentary Steve Jobs, the Man in the Machine, Jobs was basically a jerk through and through. He fathered a daughter but denied she was his, so she didn't see him for years.
Well, after the paternity test, he then pays for her schooling and upbringing.
He also contracted Apple with Chinese factories whose conditions were so bad they drove the workers to exhaustion. Several wound up committing suicide over the breakneck pace they were expected to churn out iPads and iPhones, among other devices.
And they run to the press, and they tell the press the story about oppression, and it gets written up, and they get their 15 minutes of fame.
Speaking of the iPhone, a prototype model once went missing, and a journalist returned it to Jobs. Rather than be grateful, Jobs instead had the journalist's home raided, and his files and computers were all confiscated in the process.
You can please some of the people some of the time.
No word on whether any backup turtlenecks were lifted during the raid. Walt Disney. He created Mickey Mouse. How bad could Walt Disney really be? Plenty bad, as it turns out. He was more Wicked Witch than Snow White. As Neil Gabler exposed in his biography, Walt Disney, The Triumph of the American Imagination, Walt had a racist side, and not just because he let Song of the South happen. He was reportedly the kind of person to refer to the Seven Dwarves as a N-word pile, which isn't just terrible, it doesn't make any sense. He also used terms like pickaninny in meetings, which was an old-timey and offensive term for black children. Then there was his issue with women. As Ward Kimball, one of Disney's associates, said, he didn't trust women or cats.
Keep the faith, sweetheart.
In a letter Disney sent a woman named Mary Ford who wanted to work as an animator, he confirmed that suspicion by rejecting her outright simply because of her gender. In a letter he wrote, "Women do not do any of the creative work, as that work is performed entirely by young men. For this reason, girls are not considered for the training school." Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs appear on the letterhead, almost like they're mocking her for her silly woman chutzpah. Caravaggio. He may have been a highly respected Renaissance artist, but Caravaggio was also a murderer. A 2002 expose revealed why it was that Caravaggio killed a man named Ranuccio Tomasani. It's been long accepted that Caravaggio killed Tomasani in 1606, but most thought it was due to an argument over a tennis match. According to new evidence, however, the issue wasn't Caravaggio being a bad sport, it was a woman, specifically a prostitute. Apparently, Caravaggio had a woman named Fileti Melandroni over for a painting session and fell for her. Problem was, Tomasoni was her pimp, and Caravaggio took umbrage to this. He felt inclined to fight for her honor, which meant castrating Tomasani.
Oh, that was way harsh, Ty.
The problem, as it turned out, was that Caravaggio's steady painting hand wasn't very good at castration, and he severed his opponent's femoral artery instead, causing him to bleed out and die. So, there you have it, Caravaggio killed a pimp by slashing an artery when he meant to slash his baby maker. And that's why they never named a Ninja Turtle after him.
Hello, cruel world.
Aristotle. The great Greek philosopher Aristotle was a wise man for sure, but when it came to women, he was like a lot of other ancient philosophers. A total misogynist who pretty much had zero idea what they were talking about.
Philosophize with them.
All we are is dust in the wind, dude.
According to Charlotte Witt's essay, Feminist History of Philosophy, Aristotle held views of women that went beyond typical sexism. In his mind, women were hardly even human beings. At best, they were deformed men. For some reason, he decided that women have fewer teeth than men, rendering them incomplete, which obviously isn't true. And even though they give birth, they contribute only matter and not form to the generation of offspring. In other words, they birth a kid, but only men can shape them into actual human beings. Of course, that can only happen if the child is a man because, and these are his direct words, a woman is perhaps an inferior being. It seems like there was no perhaps about it in his mind, however, because he was just a jerk like that.
Shut it down!
Writers live through their work, and if a book is good enough, an author can achieve immortality. But once a writer becomes a household name, people start to focus on their genius and forget all about their flaws and foibles. Reality check. Some of the best novelists and short stories ever written have been penned by men and women with incredibly dark secrets. On the page, they're masters of their craft, but in real life, they've sold out colleagues, assaulted family members, and left friends trembling in fear. If you want to know which of your favorite novels were written by monsters, then brace yourself as we look at some respected writers who are actually terrible people. Hunter S. Thompson, first-class jerk.
It's our country. It's not theirs. It's not a bunch of used car dealers from Southern California. Democracy, you have to be a player.
Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas writer Hunter S. Thompson was a literary rock star both when it came to fame and his out-of-control lifestyle. The father of gonzo journalism, Thompson hung out with the Hells Angels, went to war with Richard Nixon, and consumed every drug known to man. But while he's a colorful character, you wouldn't want Thompson as your friend. Sure, he's a larger-than-life icon, but he was also a first-class jerk. Need proof? According to authors Doug Hill and Jeff Weingrad, Thompson allegedly tied actor Bill Murray to a chair, tossed him into a pool, and nearly let him drown. During the 80s, Jack Nicholson was celebrating his birthday with his family when Thompson showed up at his home in the middle of the night and shot a super powerful flare into the sky. Next, Thompson aimed a military-style spotlight at Nicholson's home and fired a pistol in the air. Then he capped the whole thing off by leaving an elk's heart and some bullet casings on Nicholson's doorstep as a joke. Very funny, Thompson, but you're definitely the only one laughing. George Orwell sold out other writers. Although George Orwell was a socialist, he was open about his distaste for the Soviet Union. Just take a glimpse at his two classic works, Animal Farm in 1984. These two novels absolutely tore the USSR a new one. But even though Orwell hated dictators and overbearing bureaucracies, that didn't stop the English author from selling out his fellow writers and artists to a powerful government agency. In the 1940s, Orwell did some work for a group called the Information Research Department. In true Orwellian fashion, that innocent-sounding name belonged to a department that specialized in churning out propaganda. The IRD's job was to smear the Soviets, so Orwell wanted to make sure they didn't hire anyone with communist sympathies. Taking aim at some high-profile names, Orwell drew up a list of writers and influential people he believed sided with the Soviets. He then handed his blacklist over to the IRD.
In bird culture, this is considered a dick move.
Yep, it was a pretty skeezy move, especially for a man whose entire career was about taking down Big Brother. The sad truth was that Orwell proved himself to be a first-class jerk and a horrible hypocrite who might have done a fine job working for the thought police. Ernest Hemingway, KGB spy. Chisel the Mount Rushmore of American writers, and you've got to include Ernest Hemingway. Papa Hemingway typed out some all-time great novels like A Farewell to Arms, For Whom the Bell Tolls, and The Old Man and the Sea, and even nabbed a Nobel Prize. But when he wasn't churning out classics, you could find him getting drunk and going on crazy adventures. He patrolled the Cuban coast in his fishing boat, hunting for Nazi subs. He drove an ambulance during World War I and worked as a journalist during the Spanish Civil War. However, things took a dark turn when Hemingway joined the KGB, the notorious Soviet spy agency. Part secret police, part intelligence organization, the KGB made its name jailing political opponents and murdering enemies of the state. When it comes to digging up dirt and hunting down dissidents, the KGB is right up there with the Stasi and the Gestapo. In other words, if you get a job with the KGB, you're automatically not cool.
Boo! Not cool!
And according to books like Spies, The Rise and Fall of the KGB in America, and Writer, Sailor, Soldier, Spy, Hemingway actually volunteered to do a bit of espionage for the Soviets. He was given the codename Argo, a ship from Greek mythology, fitting for such a nautical guy. He may be the granddaddy of modern badassery, but it turned out Hemingway was a lousy spy. According to official KGB files, Argo never delivered any political information, and the Russians soon gave up on their undercover author. J.D. Salinger, total creep. When it comes to writing, J.D. Salinger was no phony. The reclusive author was the man behind The Catcher in the Rye, one of the most beloved and debated novels of all time. But while Salinger's work has attracted legions of fans, many don't know, or overlook, his controversial history with teenage girls. As it turns out, Salinger was kind of a creep when it came to manipulating young women. He would often lure these young girls into romantic relationships by writing them letters, using both his pen and his power to seduce and trap teenagers. When he was 53, he spotted a teenage Joyce Maynard on the cover of the New York Times and soon drew her into a relationship. She would later write about her interactions with the author, describing him as more than a tad predatory. Ickier still, he began courting Jean Miller when she was just 14. He kept their uncomfortable relationship going until the girl turned 20, and then they finally hooked up. After an awkward one-night stand, Salinger dumped her immediately.
What did your mother think of this?
Well, exactly.
Of course, when it came to people his own age, Salinger was far less seductive. On one occasion, a woman showed up at his house collecting for the Red Cross, and he responded by pulling a gun and threatening to shoot her. Sure, the man was reclusive, but taking shots at the Red Cross is going a little too far with the whole angsty writer angle. Jack London, horrible racist. White Fang is one of the most famous 19th century American novels and one of the best stories ever written from a canine's point of view. But there's a lot more going on here than a simple story about a wolf dog making its way in the world. Pick up a copy of White Fang and skip to the part where the heroic beast encounters white people for the very first time after living with a tribe of Native Americans. As compared with the Indians he had known, they were to him another race of superior gods. The novel then goes on to say that White Fang's Native American master was a child god among these white-skinned ones. Yeah, it seems White Fang is a really racist wolf, probably because author Jack London is one of the biggest bigots in American literature. If you think the superior gods stuff is bad, then check out London's essay called The Salt of the Earth, which argued that whites are a race of mastery and achievement. London even wrote that genocide was just a part of natural selection, something that's perfectly acceptable when lesser breeds encounter Anglo-Saxons. And don't even get us started on his anti-Chinese 1910 short story, The Unparalleled Invasion. Here's the abridged version. China starts taking over the world, so the US and Europe wipe it off the map with biological weapons. Real uplifting stuff, London. Doesn't remind us of evil aliens at all.
Exterminate! Exterminate! Exterminate!
Roald Dahl, anti-Semitic jerk. It might come as a surprise that Roald Dahl, author of James and the Giant Peach, Matilda, and the BFG, was a bit of a monster in real life, not unlike the ghoulish characters that populate his stories. Dahl was reportedly a horrible person who made life miserable for everyone who worked at his publishing company, Alfred A. Knupf. According to one account by editor-in-chief Robert Gottlieb, whenever Dahl dropped by the office, he treated secretaries like servants and threw tantrums when he didn't get his way. When the company finally told Dahl to get a grip or get out, everyone in the office supposedly got on their desks and cheered. Dahl was so bad that his first wife nicknamed him Roald the Rotten. In addition to being generally ill-tempered, he was allegedly racist. In the original versions of Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, the Oompa Loompas weren't eerie-looking orange dwarves from a mystical island. Instead, they were actually black pygmies. As pointed out by the BBC, in James and the Giant Peach, the character of the grasshopper proclaims, "I'd rather be fried alive and eaten by a Mexican." But worst of all, Dahl went on the record in 1983 during an interview with New Statesman saying, "There is a trait in the Jewish character that does provoke animosity. Even a stinker like Hitler didn't just pick on them for no reason." That's right. According to Roald Dahl, the Jewish people deserved what they got during the Holocaust, which is definitely not a story you want your kids to hear.
You can quote Oscar Wilde and say, "When I am gone, I hope it will be said, my sins were scarlet, but my books were red."
Game shows have been around almost as long as TV itself. There are all kinds of styles and formats, but for all the variety of potential games, there is one tried and true constant: the host. The game show host is usually friendly, upbeat, and excels at innocuous banter while explaining the rules and bringing the contestants along for the ride. However, it's worth remembering that the host you see on TV is just a persona. In real life, some of these hosts are as awesome as they are on TV, but others, like the following, are just awful. Bob Barker. The unofficial king of daytime game shows, Bob Barker hosted The Price is Right from 1972 to 2007. And while he's long been associated with the high energy and good times of that show, there was more going on behind the scenes than most of us realized. The Price is Right has a history of using models known as Barker's Beauties to showcase the fabulous prizes. But in 1994, one of those models, Diane Parkinson, filed a lawsuit against Barker alleging sexual harassment. The suit was dropped later when Parkinson said it was taking a toll on her health. However, this suit was followed by more from model Holly Hallstrom and others. Barker admitted to having a relationship with Parkinson, but claimed it was consensual. Hallstrom's suit was settled, and though Barker called it frivolous, a court agreed that she had been unfairly fired for gaining weight and for refusing to spread lies about Parkinson in the media. The details of the settlement weren't made public, but it's safe to assume the price was right. Pat Sajak. Wheel of Fortune has been on TV since 1975, with Pat Sajak hosting since 1981. While his on-screen chemistry with both Vanna White and the contestants is mostly innocuous stuff, off-screen things have gotten a little contentious. On Twitter, he has loudly and aggressively espoused his disbelief in the science behind climate change. In a since-deleted post from May 2014, he wrote, "I now believe global warming alarmists are unpatriotic racists, knowingly misleading for their own ends. How racism factored into this is anyone's guess." Sajak later tried to backtrack his comment, saying it was just meant as a joke, the racist part tossed in to highlight the name-calling directed at those who don't believe in science. Either way, he's been denying climate change for quite some time. Chuck Woolery. Back in the 70s and 80s, Chuck Woolery was the quintessential game show host. From a stint as the original host of Wheel of Fortune to his runs on Love Connection and Scrabble, he came across as a good and reliable guy. Fast forward to the age of social media, and Woolery began sharing his political opinions online. While there's nothing wrong with that, some feel he took things too far with some of his more outlandish and aggressive views, such as his belief that minorities don't need civil rights. Furthermore, he believes everyone gets discriminated against, citing his own experiences with ageism. So what's the big deal? On Twitter, Woolery's comments have garnered him accusations of anti-Semitism and prejudice against Islam as well, while he's also claimed ignorance of past racism and politics. Richard Dawson. Few game show hosts are as memorable as Family Feud's Richard Dawson. He would occasionally make fun of contestants, which is still a staple on The Feud over 40 years later. He also had a penchant for locking lips with almost every single woman who appeared on the show, which likely wouldn't fly these days. But despite all that, he was charming and funny and seemed like a likable enough guy, but that was on camera. Behind the scenes, rumors of Dawson's behavior were a little less than complimentary. The book Television Game Show Hosts details how Dawson's ego began to grow as the show blew up. He would clash with producers over whether contestant answers qualified, and he'd tell long stories that ate up screen time and jokes that needed to be edited out. He'd get angry when light bulbs were burned out. At one point, he even forbade a show producer from coming on set and hired his own daughter-in-law to fill the role. In a number of ways, he became the parody of a game show host he ended up playing in the movie The Running Man. Steve Harvey. As charming and fun as Steve Harvey can be on camera as the host of Family Feud, he's no stranger to controversy behind the scenes. A staff email Harvey sent to the crew of his daytime talk show was leaked to the press, and it demonstrated the level of control Harvey expects to have over his employees. Variety reprinted the message, and it includes instructions like, "My security team will stop everyone from standing at my door who have the intent to see me or speak to me." Harvey has also joked on his show about how women would never want to date Asian men. Other highlights of his least respectable views range from blatant sexism to homophobia to his belief that atheists have no morality. Survey says Steve Harvey isn't as nice as he plays on TV.
I mean, you know, if a guy is out for one thing, it's best to go for shallow, unintelligent women.
Ben Stein. Most people know Ben Stein from one of two places, Ferris Bueller's Day Off or as the host of Win Ben Stein's Money, but he has actually been in law and politics for years, including stints as a speechwriter for Richard Nixon and Gerald Ford. That said, he is also known for having some pretty questionable ideas. Stein made a documentary called Expelled, No Intelligence Allowed, that was critical of evolution. It goes so far as to portray anyone who supports evolution as un-American, and it also links evolution to eugenics and the Nazi Party. The Anti-Defamation League actually released a statement denouncing the film for its misappropriation of the Holocaust. Stein once also wrote a defense of Dominique Strauss-Kahn, a French politician who's been accused of numerous sexual assaults. Stein's defense rested on the idea that Strauss-Kahn was either too important to sexually assault someone, or that it's just not a thing people like him do. Yes, if we've learned anything in our modern era, it's that rich, powerful men never use that power to harass women. It's no secret that history has seen its fair share of terrible politicians. Occasionally, however, somebody might be remembered as a great statesman or a beloved national treasure, despite being totally undeserving of their reputation. These are the respected politicians who are actually terrible people. Woodrow Wilson wasn't just the 28th president of the United States, he was also a straight-up racist. And sure, American attitudes towards race were generally backwards back in the late 19th and early 20th century, but Wilson really was something else. Under his leadership, the federal government was resegregated, despite having actually made some decent progress toward racial integration. He also fired almost all of his black employees and unilaterally defeated an amendment at the Versailles Convention recognizing the principle of racial equality. On top of this, he wrote a history book that was sympathetic to the KKK. So much so, in fact, that it was even quoted in the infamous film Birth of a Nation. Wilson also had a problem with women, specifically women who wanted to vote. It's actually pretty ironic that the 19th Amendment was ratified while he was in office. He certainly wasn't one of its most enthusiastic proponents. Indeed, Wilson once told his staff that, "I am definitely and irreconcilably opposed to women's suffrage." One of Wilson's aides later remembered that Wilson had once insisted, "A woman's place was in the home," and the type of woman who took an active part in the suffrage agitation was totally abhorrent. Even a woman who simply spoke in public made him feel, in his words, chilled and scandalized. As far as politicians go, Nelson Mandela is considered by most as close to a saint as you can possibly get. As it turns out, however, his wife and later ex-wife, Winnie Mandela, was less saintly, to say the least. Their marriage survived almost 3 decades of Nelson's imprisonment, but fell apart in 1996 when it was revealed she had cheated on him with her younger bodyguard. Like her husband, Winnie was a bona fide revolutionary and even earned herself the title of Mother of the Nation, but her methods were downright horrific. Winnie was known for her involvement in the so-called necklacing of police informers and apartheid collaborators, a method of execution in which a gasoline-soaked car tire is placed around the victim's neck and set on fire. She even once famously said, "With our boxes of matches and our necklaces, we shall liberate this country." Over the course of the 1980s and 90s, Winnie was implicated in a number of kidnappings and killings, and was also convicted of theft and fraud in 2003. When she went before the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in the 90s, the Archbishop Desmond Tutu said of her role in the fight against apartheid, "She was a tremendous stalwart of our struggle, an icon of liberation. Something went wrong, horribly badly wrong." Winnie, for her part, apologized to the commission for her actions.
It is true. Things went horribly wrong. For that, I am deeply sorry.
Many of Lyndon B. Johnson's more unsavory exploits are pretty well known, such as his penchant for exposing himself in an attempt to assert his dominance over others. But Johnson's power games went so much further than that. Johnson's relationships with the women in his life were particularly mired by abuse and control. One biography of the 36th president claims that he would pick out his wife's clothes, select her haircut, and force her to wear lipstick. His secretaries received the same treatment, being made to do their hair certain ways, with Johnson even picking out their bathing suits. He even told them how much hairspray to use. And of course, there was the fact that he frequently got naked in the presence of his colleagues. One writer once said that what would be sexual harassment today was part of the everyday atmosphere of Johnson's office. Men had it almost as bad too, with Johnson frequently abusing his Secret Service staff, forcing colleagues to follow him into the bathroom, and even exposing himself to journalists when he couldn't answer their questions. Although his name is practically synonymous with peace, freedom, and civil rights, many of Gandhi's beliefs were backwards even for his time. For example, his sexual proclivities were risque enough that one political rival once referred to him as a, quote, dangerous semi-repressed sex maniac. Despite practicing celibacy for much of his life, Gandhi often had young women sleep and bathe with him, even when his wife was still alive. But that's not nearly the worst that Gandhi got away with. Having lived in South Africa for over 2 decades, Gandhi was given more than ample opportunity to indulge in his own deeply racist beliefs. In short, he hated the country's black population and wanted them to be segregated in pretty much every public space, from hospitals to trains. He almost always referred to black people by a racial slur and believed it was desperately important that whites remain in charge of the country. Gandhi's views on women were also abhorrent. He believed that menstruation was, quote, a manifestation of the distortion of a woman's soul, and proudly wrote that women should be held responsible for any attacks they suffered. He even went so far as to say women who were assaulted had, quote, lost their value as human beings, and that a father was well within his rights to kill a daughter who had been assaulted so as to restore honor to their family. Many U.S. presidents have cheated on their wives, but John F. Kennedy might well be the most notorious, having been described by historians as a compulsive womanizer. JFK slept with movie stars, secretaries, and plenty of people in between over the years, including Mimi Alford, one of his own interns.
Was he exploiting you?
Well, it certainly was an incredibly imbalanced relationship and not a good relationship in hindsight, looking back.
And on top of all that, he seemed to pay little mind to the hurt it caused his own wife. Jackie Kennedy is remembered today as having been the perfect first lady and an ever-dutiful spouse. But Jackie was fully aware of many of John's affairs, always making it perfectly clear to him that she wasn't happy about it, and even considered divorce on 2 occasions. One of these took place in 1956 when JFK left his pregnant wife at home to go on a Mediterranean cruise. Then, when Jackie gave birth to a stillborn daughter, her husband couldn't even be bothered to cut his vacation short and come home to her. Every time she thought of ending her marriage, however, Jackie was talked out of it by her family. Her sister pointed out that their father had cheated on their mother and that had worked out all right. Meanwhile, her mother said it was simply the price Jackie must pay for being married to a powerful man. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill may have been best known for leading the UK's stand against the Nazis in World War II, but his less savory side is no secret either. Many critics have accused Churchill of holding deeply racist views and pursuing destructive imperialist policies while in office. Fewer people, however, will be aware of his early battles against the women's rights movement. Churchill was vehemently opposed to women getting the vote, and the suffragettes singled him out as the one politician they needed to bring down, in some cases literally. In 1909, for example, an activist named Teresa Garnett came at him with a whip and attempted to force him into the path of a train. Around the same time, after a group of suffragettes had interrupted one of his meetings, Churchill said, "Nothing would induce me to vote for giving votes to women." But the suffragists didn't give up. They attended his speeches, heckled him, and generally made as many disruptions as they could. Christabel Pankhurst was actually arrested after one such incident, and Churchill said he hoped sitting in jail would, in his words, soothe her fevered brain. Nonetheless, the suffragettes won out, eventually. In 1918, women over the age of 30 were given the vote in the UK, but only if they or their husbands owned property of a certain value. It wasn't until 1928 that all women were granted fully equal voting rights to men. Strom Thurmond was so beloved by his constituents that he was a continuous presence in the Senate for 49 years, making him the longest-serving senator in United States history at the time of his retirement. But for all his many electoral successes, Thurmond had a serious dark side. In 1948, Thurmond ran for president on a states' rights and segregationist platform and even managed to get over 1 million votes. He then continued his fight against equality after getting elected into the Senate. In 1957, President Dwight D. Eisenhower proposed a handful of basic civil rights laws, but Thurmond was having none of it. He filibustered all on his own for a whopping 24 hours and 18 minutes, which to this day is still the longest speech in Senate history. But what makes Thurmond much worse than your run-of-the-mill racist was that he was also a raging hypocrite. The whole time that he was declaring that black people and white people should be separated, he was hiding a mixed-race daughter of his own. Thurmond was 22 years old when he had impregnated a 15-year-old black domestic worker. He ignored his child right up until she was 16, after which he started giving her money, partially to keep her quiet since he knew the scandal could end his political career. The truth of Thurmond's hypocrisy wasn't fully revealed until after his death in 2003, when his daughter, Essie Mae Washington Williams, finally came forward. Nicolas Sarkozy was president of France from 2007 to 2012, and perhaps one of his most infamous traits was his love of all things glamorous. Known as the bling-bling president, Sarkozy frequently wore Rolexes and custom-made Italian suits. He also divorced his second wife and quickly married the wealthy model Carla Bruni. Perhaps inevitably then, it was money that eventually led to Sarkozy's political downfall. Liliane Bettencourt was the heiress to the French cosmetics company L'Oréal. She was also absurdly wealthy. When she died in 2017, she was the wealthiest woman in the world with a net worth of nearly $40 billion. But Betancourt was also accused of secretly giving hundreds of thousands of euros in illegal campaign contributions to Sarkozy and another government minister. This, however, was far from the only illegal money Sarkozy was accused of snapping up. In 2018, he was questioned by the police after taking cash from the late Libyan dictator Muammar Gaddafi to finance his 2007 electoral campaign. Around $6.2 million was allegedly handed over in 3 suitcases stuffed full of cash. Overall, Sarkozy was thought to have received 50 million euros. This, of course, wasn't just incredibly shady, it was also outright illegal. As such, in 2021, he and 2 co-defendants were convicted of corruption and sentenced to 3 years, 2 suspended and 1 in prison. Everyone knows about Bill Clinton's dealings with Monica Lewinsky, which is perhaps one of the most famous affairs of all time.
I did not have sexual relations with that woman.
But although there was a severe power and age imbalance between the two, that affair was at least consensual. According to a number of women, however, that wasn't the case with many of Clinton's other encounters. In 1991, Clinton was attending a conference in Little Rock as the governor of Arkansas. Afterwards, he invited a woman named Paula Jones back to his suite. After talking for a few minutes, Clinton allegedly reached down and grabbed her hand, pulling her close. He then ran his hand up her thigh and tried to kiss her neck when she tried to stop him. After Clinton undressed and started making demands, Jones refused and fled. Kathleen Willey is another of Clinton's accusers. In 1993, she went to the Oval Office for professional advice, where Clinton groped her, grabbed her crotch, and rubbed himself on her. But the worst accusation of all comes from Juanita Broaddrick. In 1978, Broaddrick was volunteering for Clinton's gubernatorial campaign when he invited her to have coffee in his hotel room. Once there, she claims he assaulted her. Clinton was never charged for the incident, however, and to this day, it has largely been forgotten.
Sometimes it seems like the world has far too many jerks and not enough geniuses. However, it turns out that being a jerk and being a genius aren't mutually exclusive. In fact, some of the most famous minds in history have belonged to some of humanity's most colossal creeps. Here's a look at some geniuses who are actually terrible people. Isaac Newton's insane pettiness. Sir Isaac Newton is up there with the greatest scientists of all time. Among his many accomplishments, he managed to invent calculus, figure out the 3 laws of motion, and discover gravity. He was also constantly involved in petty disputes with other scientists about just how much credit he should get. Mathematician Gottfried Leibniz is perhaps his most famous adversary, but that's partially because Newton allegedly went out of his way to completely erase another rival from the history books. Robert Hooke, a brilliant scientist called the English Da Vinci. Hooke and Newton disagreed on many things, including whether or not Hooke should get credit for his contributions to the theory of gravity. Once Hooke died, though, the argument was over, as Newton went on a smear campaign to tarnish Hooke's reputation. Newton allegedly may have been behind the destruction of the only known contemporary painting of Hooke to ensure history would forget Hooke's face, a move known in scientific circles as the theory of total pettiness. Nikola Tesla believed in eugenics. If you're not familiar with eugenics, it's the idea that mankind should be bred for specific mental and physical traits in order to create what some might term a master race. At least that's what the Nazis were aiming for with their program of eugenics. But Hitler wasn't the only one in favor of the idea. Genius inventor Nikola Tesla was all about it too. Yep, that's right. In 1935, right as the Nazis were coming to power, Tesla wrote an article for Liberty magazine predicting that by the year 2100, eugenics would be all the rage. He wrote, "In past ages, the law governing the survival of the fittest roughly weeded out the less desirable strains. Then man's new sense of pity began to interfere with the ruthless workings of nature. As a result, we continue to keep alive and to breed the unfit. The only method compatible with our notions of civilization and the race is to prevent the breeding of the unfit by sterilization and the deliberate guidance of the mating instinct." Tesla went on to applaud the sterilization of criminals and people with mental health disorders. He wanted governments to make marriage more difficult to ensure only people viewed as desirable parents would be allowed to breed. Yikes. Steve Jobs was a tyrant. Apple visionary Steve Jobs was reportedly a jerk to nearly everyone he came in contact with. The list of offenses is nearly endless, from firing people with no warning and no severance, to cursing out his employees, to asking people during job interviews if they were virgins. In one famous incident from the birth of the company, Jobs was offered a large bonus to do a job for Atari. Instead, he got his friend Steve Wozniak to do it, and lied to him about how much they were being paid, only giving him a small percent of the fee. But he was perhaps worse to his daughter Lisa, whom he denied was his daughter even after a DNA test proved it. She ended up on welfare while he enjoyed his millions. But hey, at least we all have cool phones now, right? Albert Einstein was a terrible husband. Einstein is pretty much required to be on any list of geniuses. But one person who probably didn't think Einstein was all that was his long-suffering first wife, Mileva Maric. In 1912, Einstein began a relationship with his cousin Elsa. Needless to say, Mileva wasn't pleased. In 1914, Einstein delivered a letter to his wife detailing a list of demands she had to meet if she wanted to stay married to him. She was required to make his meals and clean his house, but wasn't allowed to talk to him unless given permission, and was prohibited from requesting any kind of affection or intimacy. What a great deal! Instead, the couple separated later that year, and once the divorce was finalized, Einstein just went ahead and married his cousin. Oh, and some people think he took credit for her work too, so that pretty much stinks all around. Elia Kazan's Witch Hunt. The brilliant director behind classics like On the Waterfront, East of Eden, and A Streetcar Named Desire, Elia Kazan also helped found the prestigious Actors Studio, so you'd expect him to be beloved in Hollywood. In reality, though, he ended his life an outcast. Why? Well, at the height of the Red Scare in 1952, he was called before the House Un-American Activities Committee and asked to give up the names of suspected communists in Hollywood. He happily complied and even took out an ad in the New York Times urging other people to participate in the witch hunt. The 8 people he named were blacklisted from Hollywood, their careers destroyed. Kazan, on the other hand, won the Oscar for Best Director 3 years later for On the Waterfront, a movie about how being a snitch is totally cool.
You're a cheap, lousy, dirty, stinking mug! And I'm glad what I've done to you. You hear that? I'm glad what I've done.
Times changed, though, and in 1999, Kazan was given the Oscar for Lifetime Achievement. Actors including Sean Penn took out an ad decrying the decision. On the night, hundreds of protesters were outside the broadcast. When he received the award, actors like Ed Harris and Nick Nolte refused to stand up for him or even clap.
In the last circle of hell are all the traitors, right? And there's one down there for Elia Kazan.
For his part, though, Kazan never regretted his actions, writing in his 1988 autobiography that it was an example of his, quote, true self.
Do you regret the decision now that you did that?
No, I don't. I'm the opposite.
Athletes who make it to the Olympics are expected to be the best of humanity, and that includes acting as role models for the rest of us. And it doesn't always work out, however, and sometimes once respected Olympians turn out to be truly terrible people. Here are a few of them. Felix Verdejo Sanchez is a lightweight boxer who represented Puerto Rico at the 2012 London Olympics. Even though he didn't medal at the Games, his professional record saw only 2 losses out of 29 fights, so he was successful by pretty much any definition of the word. But in 2021, Verdejo was charged with a truly horrific crime. He stands accused of kidnapping a woman, punching her, injecting her with a number of substances, tying her body to a block, and throwing her from a bridge into the water. He also allegedly shot her once she was in the water. As of August 2021, Verdejo has not yet been convicted, and it's entirely possible that he could be found not guilty. However, the charges are based on information from a witness who saw the whole incident take place, plus cellular data and CCTV recordings. The woman he is alleged to have killed is Keishla Rodriguez, who is Verdejo's pregnant mistress. Rodriguez's mother later told El Nuevo Dia, "I told her be careful because he had threatened her not to have the baby, that he had his family, that he is a boxer, that he is a public figure." The crimes with which Sanchez has been charged are so barbaric that Verdejo is eligible for the death penalty, although prosecutors have not yet said if they will seek it during the trial. Scott Miller is an Australian athlete who took home the silver for the 100-meter butterfly at the 1996 Summer Games in Atlanta, as well as a bronze as a member of the 4x100-meter medley relay team that same year. Outside the Olympics, he was the 1995 world champion in the 100-meter butterfly at Rio de Janeiro. But being really good at swimming doesn't always pay the bills, something Miller himself apparently realized. In 2021, he was arrested for allegedly breaking bad when police found $2 million Australian dollars worth of methamphetamine concealed in candles at his house. At a news conference, Detective Superintendent John Watson discussed the scale of the drug selling operation.
They were well set up, and they were intent on delivering death and misery right throughout the state.
This was far from the first drug arrest for Miller. In 2009, he pleaded guilty to 5 charges. He received 100 hours of community service, a slap on the wrist that obviously didn't teach him much of anything, since he was later apprehended with large quantities of meth on 2 separate occasions in June and July of 2013. Cleet Keller was once a standout swimmer for Team USA, competing at the Summer Olympics in 2000, 2004, and 2008. He was a teammate of Michael Phelps, and together they won gold as members of the 4x200-meter freestyle relay team in both Athens and Beijing. Keller also won a silver in the 4x200-meter freestyle relay in 2000 and 2 bronze medals in Athens and Sydney. But once he stopped competing professionally, Keller's life went downhill. At one point, he was homeless, living out of his car in rest stops and Walmart parking lots. By early 2021, however, those who knew him thought things were getting better for the former Olympian. He'd started a career in real estate and had even gotten engaged. Keller's friends and acquaintances also knew he was a pretty big supporter of President Donald Trump, but they were still shocked when they saw him appear in video footage taken from inside the U.S. Capitol during the insurrection on January 6th. He was even wearing his Team USA jacket. Members of the swimming community exchanged messages and contacted the authorities. In January, just days after the riot, Keller was charged with violent entry, obstructing law enforcement, and disorderly conduct. And the next month, the grand jury added civil disorder, obstructing an official proceeding, entering a restricted building, and disorderly conduct in a restricted building. The charges could mean 30 years or more behind bars. Perhaps the most notorious fall from grace of any Olympian was that of Oscar Pistorius. Born missing parts of his feet and lower legs, Pistorius' legs were amputated below the knee before he was a year old. Nonetheless, he took home 8 medals, 6 of them gold, across 3 Paralympic Games in 2004, 2008, and 2012. He made history in 2012, becoming only the 3rd Paralympian to compete against able-bodied athletes at the London Olympics. Other accomplishments include setting world records in the 200-meter and 400-meter events, and twice being named one of Time magazine's 100 most influential people in the world. Then, in what a South African judge called a human tragedy of Shakespearean proportions, Pistorius killed his girlfriend, Riva Steenkamp.
Oscar Pistorius is appearing in a South African court right now, being charged with the murder of his girlfriend.
Steenkamp had only been dating the Olympian for 3 months when Pistorius killed her after firing 4 gunshots through the bathroom door of his home. Pistorius defended his actions by saying that he didn't mean to kill her, that he woke up, heard noises, and fired his gun because he thought she was an intruder. This explanation fell apart, however, when neighbors testified that they had heard the couple screaming at each other right before Pistorius opened fire. His first trial in 2014 resulted in only a 5-year sentence, and a second one in 2016 replaced that with a 6-year sentence. Finally, the South African Supreme Court got involved in the case in 2017, sentencing Pistorius to 13 years and 5 months behind bars. Luka Klasins represented Slovakia in the men's singles figure skating event at the 1992 Albertville Winter Olympics, where he came in 26th. After his career ended, he started a company that put on ice-themed amusement park-style events. Then, in 2021, Klasins was charged with bank fraud and aggravated identity theft for trying to scam almost $1.5 million out of the relief fund the U.S. set up for struggling small businesses during the COVID-19 pandemic. In the wake of Klasins' arrest, the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York laid out his crimes in a statement, which read, "As alleged, Klasins used false documents to try and obtain over $1 million in funds intended to help hardworking Americans, but thanks to the diligence of the FBI, his plans have been put on ice. He will now be held accountable for his alleged brazen lies." Klasins has yet to be convicted of the crime, so this is another case in which anything could happen. But if he really did try to steal $1.6 million worth of taxpayer money that should have gone to small businesses in need, he might not be able to skate on the charges. When it was reported that wrestler Sushil Kumar would miss the delayed 2020 Tokyo Olympics, ESPN referred to him as arguably India's greatest Olympian, and that's probably a fair estimation. He's the only person from his country to win individual medals in 2 different Olympic Games, a bronze in Beijing in 2008 and a silver 4 years later in London. So why won't Kumar make Tokyo? Because he's in prison. Kumar was the instigator in a fight that saw 3 men, fellow wrestlers at an academy in Delhi, beaten so badly that one of them died. Afterward, Kumar went on the run across India for 3 weeks before being apprehended. Kumar hasn't yet been convicted of the charges as of August 2021, but if the case against him is as strong as it seems, it could spell trouble for the famous Olympian. On top of fleeing after the incident, one police officer said, "We have recorded statements of all the victims, and they all made allegations against Sushil Kumar. The former Olympian's lawyers have accused the police of bias, but if anything, their bias might be towards the wrestler." As a viral photo showed a group of cops posing with Kumar after his arrest, with wide smiles on all their faces. Australian Olympic kayaker Nathan Bagley took home 2 silver medals at the 2004 Athens Games. But shortly after that, it seems, he decided his real calling was drugs. First, he tested positive for steroids in 2005 and was hit with a 15-month suspension. While he said he would aim to be back for the 2008 Games in Beijing, his own drug business got in the way. In 2007, Bagley was found with 800 ecstasy tabs in his car, plus some weed and cash. In 2009, he was jailed for his involvement in an ecstasy manufacturing ring. After his release from prison, he said,
"I just asked for an opportunity just to give me a chance to see what I can do, and I know I won't be making the same mistakes again."
A year later, he was arrested for possessing 84 ecstasy tablets and pill press components. Not slowing down, 2015 saw him face charges of operating a full-blown drug ring. But 2018 was Bagley's true masterstroke. Alongside his brother, he tried to get 650 kilos of cocaine, worth over 200 million Australian dollars, into the country. Bagley bought a speedboat and instructed his brother and another man to go 200 miles off the coast and pick up the drugs. Unfortunately for them, the pair was caught by the naval authorities. The men tried to get away, speeding off in the boat and throwing kilos of cocaine into the ocean as they went, but to no avail. Bagley was convicted in 2021 and is currently awaiting sentencing. Known as the Flying Scot, David Jenkins competed in 3 Olympics for Great Britain, winning the silver in the 4x400 meter relay with his team at Munich 1972, as well as making the individual 400 meter finals at Montreal 1976 and Moscow 1980, although he finished 7th in both of those appearances. Between his 2 final Olympics, he was often injured, to the point that it was surprising when he managed to qualify for the Games at Moscow. 7 years later, after Jenkins had retired and moved to California, he was busted for his new job, making and smuggling illegal steroids. He was one of the main producers behind the facility in Mexico that made the drugs and then trafficked them into the US. At one point, Jenkins and his crew were reportedly responsible for more than 2/3 of all the illegal steroids circulating in the US. Jenkins also admitted he'd used steroids later in his running career, which puts his amazing recovery for the Moscow Games in a wholly different light. It's worth noting that no athletes were actually drug tested at the Moscow Games. Jenkins was sentenced to 7 years for his crimes, but only ended up serving 9 months. When he got out, he set up a supplement company with another convicted drug felon and is now thought to be worth millions. These days, Lance Armstrong's reputation as a doper seems to have eclipsed his reputation as an athlete. In fact, many people might not even be aware that he was an Olympian, and a medalist at that. Despite being most famous for his domination of the Tour de France, the cyclist also competed in the 1996 Atlanta Games, where his highest placement was 6th, and the 2000 Sydney Olympics, where he got a bronze in the time trials. In between the 2 games, he'd gotten cancer, which made it all the more impressive, seemingly anyway. Plenty of Olympic athletes have been caught doping over the years, but Lance Armstrong didn't just dope a little, and he didn't dope on his own either. He took the art of passing drug tests to another level, somehow producing clean urine while using essentially all the banned performance enhancers available to him. When his activities were finally discovered, the United States Anti-Doping Agency declared in their report that Armstrong was a prolific doper, and that he ruthlessly made those around him, his teammates, dope just as much. Essentially, he bullied people into risking their jobs and their health just so he could get the glory. In 2013, after Armstrong admitted his crimes to Oprah, the International Olympic Committee asked for the bronze medal back. It took him 8 months to return it.
The Catholic Church and its popes have been around a long time, but you know what they say about power? Unfortunately, not every pope has been incorruptible. Here are popes who were actually terrible people. Of all the Holy Fathers to be notable for their less than sterling morality, Alexander VI is unquestionably the most famous. In his 9 years as pontifex, Alexander VI was accused of murdering his political enemies with poison, unchecked nepotism, and various other things that popes are definitely not supposed to do. As for why he's so notable, you really only need to look at his name. Before ascending to the papacy, Alexander VI was Rodrigo Borgia. On the off chance that name doesn't ring a bell, the Borgias were one of the most powerful families in Rome during the Renaissance and were so well known for their criminal exploits that Showtime made a prestige drama about them that ran for 3 seasons. Alexander VI in particular was considered so power-hungry and evil that he's literally the final boss of Assassin's Creed 2, one of the only video games we can think of that ends with the hero getting into a fistfight with the Pope. Pope Stephen VI held a special kind of grudge. He hated his predecessor Formosus so much that he dug him up and put his dead body on trial. Stephen propped the former pope's body up in a chair, assigned a deacon to speak for it, and, by all accounts, started screaming at the corpse about how Formosus was an illegitimate pope. Formosus was found guilty on all counts, so Stephen meted out the very logical punishment of chopping off the skeletal fingers that Formosus had used for blessings, buried him in an unmarked grave, then dug him up again and had his body thrown in the Tiber River. Perhaps unsurprisingly, this didn't sit well with the population of Rome, especially once the cadaver washed up on the banks of the Tiber and the holy skeleton began performing miracles on the townsfolk. Stephen VI was deposed, imprisoned, and strangled to death. As for Formosus, a few of Stephen's successors had him reburied with full honor, and also made a new rule that officially prohibited putting dead bodies on trial, which was the kind of rule that no one thought they actually needed to write down until then. You've probably heard of the Divine Comedy, an epic poem from the 14th century that's best known for its depiction of hell. Dante's Inferno consists of 9 circles, which get worse and worse until you finally get to the bottom. If you back up a little and check out the 8th circle, however, you'll find a mention that hell is eagerly awaiting the arrival of Pope Boniface VIII, who it seems was not exactly Dante's favorite person. The reasons? Well, Boniface is largely remembered for his downright authoritarian view of the Church's role in the world. After taking over from Celestine V, Boniface attempted to raise money to start a new crusade. When that failed, he just went to war with Cardinal Jacopo Colonna instead. It was during this conflict that Cologna's last holdout, the city of Palestrina, peacefully surrendered after promises by Boniface that they would be spared. Surprise! The city was actually razed to the ground and the earth salted so nothing could grow there. It's not often that you can compare a pope to Darth Vader, but with Palestrina as his personal alderman, Boniface VIII certainly qualifies.
I find your lack of faith disturbing.
While Rome had been the traditional home of the Catholic Church since about 33 AD, there was a period of about 70 years in the 14th century where the popes ruled from Avignon, France, instead. Eventually, however, Gregory XI decided he wanted to regain control of the Papal States, which kicked off the truly Game of Thrones-sounding War of the Eight Saints against Florence. Sadly, this particular conflict did not involve the Mother of Dragons. Instead, Gregory relied on some equally non-traditional tactics, including excommunicating every member of the Florentine government and banning all religious services in the city. When the Florentine citizens continued to hold religious services, Gregory instead authorized his armies to seize their properties and enslave the citizens themselves.
Scientists are way smarter than most people, but sometimes they change the world for the worse. We hear about the discoveries of some of the world's most famous scientists, but we don't hear about the terrible stuff. Here are respected scientists who were terrible people. Erwin Schrödinger is most famous for a thought experiment about putting a cat in a sealed box and rigging it up with a device that has a 50-50 chance of killing the cat. As he argues, until you open the box and check for yourself, the cat exists in an uncertain state where it is both alive and dead at the same time. It turns out that's a pretty fitting legacy for this guy, since he proved you could be a brilliant physicist and also a complete scumbag. Saying he had numerous affairs is putting it lightly. According to his biographer, Schrödinger kept a series of little black books to record the names of the women he had affairs with and to rate each of them. At least 3 of his mistresses gave him children, and 1 provided him with the inspiration to develop his famous wave equation. They were all adults, and that's fine, but it gets much worse. Schrödinger also did some tutoring with students that included 14-year-old twins that he was prone to fondling while they worked on their math lessons. One of them, Ithie Junger, became pregnant 3 years later, and Schrödinger quickly moved on. Brothers John and William Hunter aren't household names, but they're credited with major discoveries about human anatomy and the interactions between organs. Unfortunately, they developed all of those discoveries through literal grave robbing. Both anatomists were connected to a shady assistant who procured cadavers for them to dissect. William's personal Igor was his unfortunately named assistant William Smellie, and some historians believe the two were linked to a series of London murders between 1749 and 1755, which would likely make them responsible for the deaths of 40 pregnant women. By the time the brothers were done, they had dissected more than 2,000 bodies gathered up through straight-up Frankenstein tactics. Oh, and John? He also pioneered the idea of taking teeth from the poor and giving them to the rich as transplants. Robin Hood he was not. James D. Watson turned his love of birdwatching into a career in research and genetics, and then won a Nobel Prize for discovering the shape of DNA. Unfortunately, there are more than a few people who believe he took credit for the work of another scientist, Rosalind Franklin. That's just the tip of this terrible iceberg, though. Watson has gone on record as saying genetic engineering should be used to make all girls pretty, and he's spoken freely on his beliefs that there's a connection between race and intelligence. He ultimately retired in 2007 after giving an interview where he stated he was inherently gloomy about the prospect of Africa because he disagreed with the premise that their intelligence is the same as ours. This is the same guy who spoke out in 1997 in favor of allowing genetic testing to determine whether a baby was going to be gay, adding that homosexuality should be a reason for abortion. In 2014, he also became the first person to sell his Nobel medallion because he didn't like the way the scientific community shunned him after his racist remarks. Without Jack Parsons, or to use his original and staggeringly awesome name, Marvel Whiteside Parsons, there would be no space shuttle, not to mention the military applications of his developments in rocketry. He was an aeronautic genius, and he also believed he had summoned Satan when he was 13 years old. Parsons was a huge devotee of occultist Aleister Crowley and did a lot of dancing naked by the moonlight. That's not particularly terrible, but his attempts to summon the Antichrist through weird sex magic rituals he performed with the help of L. Ron Hubbard aren't exactly good either. Without going into too much detail, the basics are that Parsons and Hubbard performed a series of rituals to incarnate a goddess named Babylon. Babylon would be the mother of the Antichrist, and they absolutely believed they had summoned her in the body of Marjorie Cameron. Cameron joined in on all the bedroom fun, and while she did become pregnant, we'll never know if it was really the Antichrist since she had an abortion. You probably recognize John Harvey Kellogg's name, even if you don't know who he is. He's the cereal guy, and he was also a surgeon and a pioneer in the field of nutrition who promoted healthy foods like peanut butter, yogurt, and soy milk, making him pretty much responsible for everything on your breakfast table. If you've ever been disappointed by the lack of flavor in a bowl of cornflakes, there's a reason for that. Kellogg believed that tasty food led to rampant fornication and told people that soy milk was the only thing they should be thirsty for. He even went as far as suggesting the use of spiked tools and acid burns to discourage masturbation. And cornflakes? He invented those to be so bland they couldn't possibly arouse any kind of desire in anyone. He did most of his research into the relationship between nutrition and the soul at the Battle Creek Sanitarium, where he also became one of the founding members of the Race Betterment Foundation. Through that, he started a eugenics registry that helped to push the supposed superiority of anyone of a Nordic background. So maybe just go ahead and stick to pancakes from now on. William Buckland was a 19th century geologist at Oxford University, and he documented geological phenomenon, wrote papers on fossils and the dinosaurs, and made major strides in mineralogy. He also made it part of his life's work to eat anything and everything, and we do mean everything. He ate moles, crocodiles, hedgehogs, and, worst of all, he was even known to have cooked up some puppies. He never said why he felt it necessary to eat puppies, but we do know he passed his weird obsession on to his son, Francis. When the boy was a child, his father encouraged him to ride and then eat a turtle that he was allowed to behead for the cook as a treat. Much later, of course, that experience would lead Francis to grow up and found the evil ninjas of the Foot Clan.